So now I'm going to begin on the Chapter 9 RStudio assignment. So starting with task 1, I'm going to analyze the data by comparing the two means by using an independent t-test. I'm going to be doing an independent t-test because we're looking at two different groups of people, the means from two different groups. So the two groups are independent, therefore we'll be using the independent t-test. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. You can see that I'm using the t-test function to do that. We're looking specifically at mean happiness based on whatever book was read. So I'm going to run that and then take a look at that. So you can see here that the p-value was statistically significant. So there does appear to be a statistically significant difference between the means of these two groups. So in order to determine the actual size of that difference, I'm going to calculate the effect size. So in order to do that, you can see in here I already had the formulas in here. We're going to be using the formula, the square root of t squared divided by t squared plus the degrees of freedom. So once the t-test is done, both t and the degrees of freedom are stored as part of this object. So you can use this formula here to define t as the statistic 1 from the independent t-test object, and then the same thing for degrees of freedom, except it's parameter 1. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. So now that they've both been, both t and the degrees of freedom have both been specified, we can run the formula for r to get the effect size. And we see that the effect size is 0.452. This tells us that this is actually a fairly large effect, that reading these books and the differences that we see, the statistically significant difference that we see in the mean, actually is a fairly large difference. So for the write-up, I'm also going to need the means and the standard errors. So I'm going to use the by function and the descriptive statistics function to calculate the mean as well as the standard error for the two groups, which you can see down here. Next, for task 2, I'll be analyzing the data using a dependent t-test. The reason for this is that we're looking at two separate conditions using the same group of people, rather than having two separate groups with different conditions. So because we're just using the one specific group of people, we're going to use a dependent t-test. So I'm going to use the same function that I did last time. It's going to look a little bit different just because the data was set up in the spreadsheet differently. In this task, the data was in two separate columns for each of the groups, whereas in the first one, the data was all in the same column. So the formula looks a little bit different, but basically we're comparing whether they read the popular psychology book versus the stat book, what those means look like, and we set paired equal to true because this is a dependent t-test. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And then looking at this, we can see that Our p-value does show that there is a statistically significant difference between the two group means, with a p-value equal to 0.007. So in order to find out how much of an effect there really is, or the size of that difference, we're going to once again calculate R, or the effect size, using the same formula and the same method of creating the objects here for t and degrees of freedom. So I'm just going to run all of that. And it gives an R of 0.120, which is a fairly small effect size. So even though there is a statistically significant difference, that difference between the means here is fairly small. So once again, I'm also just going to use the descriptive statistics to get the mean and standard error that I need to do the write-up. So that is everything for the Chapter 9 RStudio assignment.